You don't speak unless spoken to. The sentence landed like a polished blade across the glass and gold of Veritas Hall, slicing clean through the low hum of million-dollar conversations as forks paused midair and crystal glasses hovered just short of lips. Because when Ethan Caldwell spoke, rooms didn't just listen, they obeyed. And tonight was no exception. Not in a private dining suite overlooking downtown Manhattan, where a $50 million deal sat waiting for a signature that could shift markets by morning, not with investors in tailored suits watching his every move like it was already history. And certainly not with a black waitress standing quietly beside the table, her tray balanced steady, her expression unreadable, her presence, to most of them, barely there. Just another shadow in a room built for power. But Naomi Brooks heard everything, every number, every clause, every careless word wrapped in confidence. Because invisibility had always been her advantage, the thing people underestimated right before they regretted it. And as Ethan leaned back in his chair, adjusting his cufflinks with the ease of a man who had never been told no, he didn't even look at her when he added, softer now, but somehow sharper, stay in your lane, sweetheart. This is bigger than anything you'd understand. And a few of the men chuckled, not because it was funny, but because it was safe, because laughing kept them on the right side of power. And Naomi didn't react, not immediately, her hands still, her breathing even, as if the words had passed right through her, but they hadn't. They settled, they stacked, they waited, just like everything else she had learned to carry without breaking, because what none of them knew, what none of them even considered, was that Naomi wasn't just serving wine tonight. She was listening to a deal unravel in real time, catching the one detail that didn't belong, the number that didn't match, the clause that shouldn't exist. And when she finally placed the last glass on the table, her fingers lingered for half a second longer than necessary, not out of hesitation, but precision, because moments like this didn't come twice. And when she lifted her eyes, really looked at Ethan for the first time, something shifted, subtle but undeniable, like the air itself had taken a breath. And then, without raising her voice, without asking permission, she spoke. Then maybe you should listen. And for the first time that night, the room didn't feel like his anymore. The silence did not break. It tightened, like the room itself was holding its breath, because no one had ever heard a server speak like that. Not here, not in a room where power was measured in numbers that could buy entire city blocks. And yet Naomi did not step back, did not apologize. She simply stood there, calm, steady, as if she had just stated a fact instead of crossing an invisible line no one else dared to touch. And Ethan's smile did not disappear, but it changed, thinner now, sharper. The kind of smile that comes before a man reminds everyone exactly who he is. Excuse me, he said, finally looking at her, really looking this time, like she had just become a problem that needed to be solved, not a person. I do not remember inviting commentary from the staff. And a few heads nodded around the table, grateful for the return to order, for the reassurance that the rules still applied, that people stayed in their place. But Naomi did not move, and that was the second crack. Smaller, quieter, but deeper, because defiance without noise is harder to dismiss. And somewhere across the table, one of the investors leaned forward, not out of defense, but curiosity, because confidence like that does not come from nowhere. And Ethan noticed it. He always noticed shifts in a room. It was how he built his empire, by controlling attention before anyone else realized it had moved. So he leaned in, voice lower now, controlled. If you have something to say, make it quick. And it sounded like permission, but it was not. It was a test, one he fully expected her to fail, because people like her always did. They spoke out of turn, they stumbled, they apologized, they disappeared. But Naomi did none of those things. Instead, she glanced at the contract resting open in front of him, the pages filled with numbers and clauses that most people in the room pretended to understand. And then she said it, not louder, not slower, just clear. The revenue figure in Section 4 does not match your last quarterly filing. And this time the silence hit differently. Not confusion, not discomfort, but recognition, because numbers do not lie, not in a room like this. And the investor who had been quiet all night straightened in his seat, his fingers tapping once against the table before he reached for the document, flipping pages with a precision that mirrored hers, while Ethan let out a short laugh, dismissive, Practiced. That is not your concern, he said. But the timing was off, just enough to feel it, just enough for doubt to slip in through the cracks. And Naomi held his gaze for exactly 1 second longer than expected. Not challenging, not aggressive, just certain. And in that certainty was something far more dangerous than anger. It was truth waiting to be seen. And as the investor's eyes scanned the page, the room began to shift again, slower this time, heavier, like something real was rising to the surface. And for the first time that night, Ethan Caldwell did not speak immediately. The sound of paper turning was louder than it should have been, each page cutting through the silence like a quiet alarm no one could ignore. And the investor's expression shifted almost imperceptibly as his eyes moved line by line, number by number, until his fingers stopped, resting on the exact clause Naomi had pointed to. And for a brief second no one spoke, because in rooms like this, truth does not announce itself. It reveals itself slowly, painfully, and then all at once. That figure, the investor said, his voice measured but no longer passive. It was reported 8 weeks ago at a different value. And now every eye moved, not to Ethan, but to the document, to the numbers that suddenly felt heavier than before, and Ethan leaned forward, his movements controlled, deliberate, the kind of composure built over years of winning. You are misreading the context, he replied smoothly. But the room did not relax, because confidence only works when no one questions it, and now they were questioning everything. And Naomi remained where she was, not stepping into the spotlight, not claiming attention, just present, like the quiet source of a ripple that had already become a wave. And across the table another executive reached for his tablet, pulling up public filings, verifying, cross-checking, because that is what power does when it senses risk. It verifies, it protects itself, and the seconds stretched long enough for doubt to take root in every corner of the room. Long enough for the weight of $50 million to feel uncertain, unstable, and Ethan felt it, not as panic, but as pressure, the kind that presses in slowly, forcing even the most controlled mind to recalculate. And for the first time that night, he was no longer directing the room, he was reacting to it. There are timing differences in reporting, he added, sharper now. But the explanation did not land the way it should have, not when the investor's screen was already displaying the discrepancy in clear, unforgiving detail, and a quiet murmur moved through the table, not loud, not chaotic, but enough to signal that the deal was no longer solid, that something fundamental had shifted, and Naomi finally stepped back, not retreating, but releasing the moment, because she had already done what she came to do. She had spoken, and that was all it took. And as the lead investor slowly closed the contract, his hand firm, decisive, the kind of movement that ends things. Without needing to say it out loud, the room understood. The balance had flipped, and Ethan Caldwell, a man who had built his name on control, was now sitting in a room he no longer owned, watching a deal slip through his fingers, not because someone shouted, not because someone fought, but because one voice, calm and precise, had told the truth at exactly the right time. No one stood up, no one raised their voice, but the deal was already over. You could feel it in the way the lead investor leaned back instead of forward, in the way his pen stayed still on the table instead of moving toward the signature line. And in rooms like this, that stillness meant everything, because money does not hesitate without reason, and doubt had already done its work. We need to pause, the investor said finally, calm, controlled, but final in a way that did not invite negotiation. And the word pause hung in the air heavier than any rejection, because everyone at that table understood what it really meant, and Ethan knew it too, even if his expression refused to show it. His jaw set just enough, his fingers tightening briefly around the edge of the contract before releasing, because men like him did not lose publicly. They adjusted, they recalculated, they found a way to regain control. There is no need for overreaction, he said, his voice steady again, practiced, reaching for authority like it was still within reach. But it did not land the same way. Not now. Not after the numbers had been questioned in front of people who built their careers on seeing through exactly that kind of inconsistency. And across the table the legal advisor cleared his throat, a small sound that carried more weight than it should have. We will need to review the filings again, he added, careful, precise, The language of caution dressed as professionalism. And that was the third shift, the one that sealed it. Because once lawyers start reviewing, deals stop moving. And everyone knew it. And Naomi was no longer part of the scene in the way they had first seen her. She had stepped back into the quiet, into the role they were comfortable with. But the room did not forget. It could not. Because her words were now embedded in every glance, every calculation, every silent question passing between the people at that table. And Ethan finally looked at her again, not as a problem, not as an interruption, but as something he had not accounted for, something that had slipped through his control, and for a fraction of a second, just long enough to matter, there was recognition there, not respect yet, but awareness, and that was new, that was dangerous, because awareness is the first step to losing certainty, and certainty had always been his advantage. You, he said, not loudly, but directly, and the single word carried a different weight now, stripped of the earlier dismissal, sharper, more focused. Where did you get that information? And it was not a question asked out of curiosity. It was a question asked out of necessity, because something in his world no longer made sense, and Naomi met his gaze without hesitation, without apology, her voice the same as before, calm, even, from your own report, she said, and that was the moment it settled, fully, undeniably. Because truth does not need volume. It only needs to be undeniable. And as the investor slowly closed the folder in front of him, signaling the end without needing to say another word, the room shifted one last time, not toward Ethan, not toward power, but toward the quiet realization that the person they had ignored at the beginning of the night had just changed everything. The room did not return to normal. It recalibrated, slower, colder, like a machine adjusting after a fault it did not expect, and conversations that once flowed with confidence now moved carefully, measured, because no one wanted to be the next person caught overlooking something that should have been obvious, and the lead investor stood, not abruptly, but with intention, the kind of movement that signals conclusion without needing permission. We will reconvene after a full review, he said, his tone neutral, but the decision behind it final. And just like that, $50 million shifted from certainty to question, from promise to risk, and risk was something this room did not tolerate lightly. And as chairs moved and quiet discussions began to form in small clusters, Ethan remained seated for a moment longer, not frozen, but still, as if calculating 1,000 outcomes at once, searching for the version of events where this did not happen, where control had not slipped, but every path led back to the same point, the same sentence, the same voice, and slowly, deliberately, he stood, adjusting his jacket, restoring the image he had built so carefully over years, because reputation does not collapse in a moment. It resists, it adapts, it fights to remain intact. But there was something different now, something subtle in the way people looked at him, not fear, not admiration, but evaluation. And that shift, more than anything, was the real loss. And across the room, Naomi had already stepped away from the table, back into motion, back into the rhythm of service, refilling glasses, clearing plates, as if nothing extraordinary had happened, as if she had not just redirected the outcome of a deal larger than most people would see in a lifetime. Because for her, this was not about attention. It never had been. It was about truth, about the discipline of seeing what others ignored and saying it when it mattered. And one of the junior analysts approached her. Hesitantly, his voice lower, almost unsure. How did you catch that? He asked, not as a challenge, but as someone trying to understand a moment that did not fit the usual order of things. And Naomi offered a small, almost unnoticeable smile, not proud, not defensive, just certain. I read, she said, simple, direct, and in that answer was something deeper than explanation. It was a reminder that knowledge does not announce itself. It waits, it watches, it acts when necessary. And across the room, Ethan's eyes found her again, not out of anger, not even frustration, but something far more complex, something quieter, the realization that the person he dismissed in seconds had understood something he overlooked in weeks. And that realization stayed with him longer than the deal itself. Because money can be regained, contracts can be rewritten, but moments like this, the ones that expose a blind spot in front of everyone who matters, those do not disappear, they reshape how the room sees you. And as the last of the investors made their way out, leaving behind a space that no longer felt like victory. The balance of power had already rewritten itself, not loudly, not dramatically, but permanently. By the time the last glass was cleared, the room no longer belonged to anyone. Not to power, not to money, not even to reputation. It belonged to the aftermath, and that was always quieter than people expected, because real consequences do not arrive with noise. They settle in slowly, reshaping everything beneath the surface. And Ethan stood near the window overlooking the city, the skyline stretching out like something he used to command, something predictable, something that moved when he moved, but tonight it felt distant, disconnected, like control had slipped just out of reach. And behind him, conversations continued in low tones, fragments of analysis, of caution, of reassessment, the kind of language that replaces certainty when doubt enters the room. And Ethan did not turn immediately when he heard footsteps approach. He already knew who it was, not because he saw her, but because there was only one person left in that space who had nothing to gain from staying and yet remained. And that kind of presence is impossible to ignore once you notice it. "You stayed," he said, his voice even, not the same tone from earlier, not dismissive, not sharp, just direct. And Naomi paused a few feet behind him, her posture relaxed, her expression calm, as if this moment carried no more weight than any other part of her night. "I am still working," she replied, simple, factual, and for a second, Ethan almost smiled, not out of amusement, but recognition, because there was something in that answer he understood. Discipline, focus, the ability to remain grounded when everything around you shifts, and that was something he respected, even if he had not seen it before. "You read filings during your shift," he said, turning slightly now, studying her with a level of attention he had not given her at the start. And Naomi met his gaze without hesitation, not challenging, not submissive, just steady. "I read whenever I can," she said. And there it was again, that quiet certainty, the kind that does not need validation. And Ethan nodded once, slowly, as if placing a piece into a puzzle that had been incomplete until now. Most people in this room missed that, he admitted, not as a compliment, but as a statement of fact. And Naomi did not respond immediately, because she did not need to. The truth had already been spoken, and after a moment, she simply said, "Most people were not looking." And the sentence landed differently than anything else that night. Not sharp, not disruptive, but clear. And in that clarity was something that lingered longer than the loss itself. Because it was not just about the deal. It was about perspective, about what people choose to see and what they ignore. And Ethan exhaled slowly, not out of frustration, but understanding, the kind that comes too late to change what already happened, but just in time to change what comes next. And for the first time that evening, there was no audience, no investors, no expectations, just two people standing in the quiet space left behind after power had shifted. And in that space, something unspoken settled between them. Not agreement, not resolution, but awareness. And awareness, once it arrives, does not leave unchanged. The city lights outside had not changed, but the room behind them had, stripped of its illusion, its certainty, its unspoken hierarchy. And as the final staff began resetting the space for the next reservation, Naomi moved with the same quiet precision she always had, folding napkins, aligning silverware, restoring order to a room that had just lost control. And Ethan remained where he was for a moment longer, watching not the skyline, but her, not in disbelief, not even in frustration, but in something closer to realization, because it is one thing to lose money. It is another to understand why you lost it, and that difference changes everything. "What are you studying?" he asked finally, the question unexpected, not strategic, just direct. And Naomi paused, just briefly, before answering. "Economics." And there was no hesitation in her voice, no attempt to impress, just truth. And Ethan nodded slowly, as if confirming something he had already begun to piece together. "That makes sense," he said, more to himself than to her. And for a second, the room felt smaller, quieter, like the distance between them had shifted in a way neither of them had planned. And across the polished table, the unsigned contract still sat where it had been left, a reminder not of failure, but of exposure. And Ethan walked toward it, picking it up, flipping once more to the page that had changed everything. His eyes scanning the same numbers that had slipped past him before, and this time, he saw it. Not because it had changed, but because he had, and that was the part no one in the room would talk about. The silent correction that happens after the damage is done. The moment when confidence is replaced by awareness. And it does not feel like defeat. It feels like clarity. And he closed the folder slowly, deliberately, as if acknowledging something he could not undo, then turned back toward Naomi. "You were right," he said, simple, unembellished, and the words carried more weight than anything he had said earlier, because men like him do not offer that easily. And Naomi met his gaze again, not surprised, not satisfied, just present. "I know," she replied, and there was no arrogance in it, only certainty, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, because there was nothing left to prove, nothing left to argue, only the quiet recognition of what had happened, and what it meant, and Ethan exhaled, a small shift, but real. $50 million, he said, almost under his breath, not as a complaint, but as a measurement, and Naomi tilted her head slightly, considering, before answering, "Or one mistake you did not catch," and that was the final shift, the one that reframed everything, because money is a result, but awareness is a cause, and causes are what define outcomes, and Ethan let out a quiet breath that might have been a laugh, might have been something else, but it was lighter than anything he had felt since the moment she spoke, and as the staff dimmed the lights and the room returned to its polished calm, the balance between them had already changed, not dramatically, not loudly, but in a way that would follow both of them long after this night ended. Because some lessons are not about losing, they are about finally seeing, and once you see, you cannot go back. The room was almost empty now, the kind of quiet that only comes after something important has already happened, when the energy has left but the impact remains, lingering in the air like a question no one can answer out loud. And as the staff finished resetting the final details, Naomi placed the last glass into position with the same care she had started the night with, unchanged in her rhythm, unchanged in her presence. Because for her, this was never about the moment, it was about the discipline that led to it, the habit of paying attention when others chose not to, and across the room, Ethan stood with the contract still in his hand, not reading it anymore, just holding it, as if it had become something else entirely, not a deal, but a reminder. And slowly, he walked back toward the table, placing the folder down where it had begun, completing a circle that no one else in the room would fully understand. And when he looked up again, his focus was no longer on the space, not on the numbers, not even on the loss. It was on Naomi. "You saw it before anyone else," he said, not as a question, not even as a compliment, but as a statement that carried weight. And Naomi did not look surprised. She did not shift under the attention. She simply nodded once, because the truth does not need decoration. "I was looking," she replied, and that was the difference, the simple, quiet difference that had changed everything. And Ethan let the words settle, because they did not challenge him. They clarified something he had not considered before, that power does not come from being the loudest voice in the room. It comes from seeing what others miss and having the discipline to act on it. And for a moment, the distance between them felt smaller, not in status, not in position, but in understanding, and Ethan adjusted his jacket again, not out of habit this time, but as if resetting himself. "Most people would have stayed quiet," he said, and there was no accusation in it, only observation, and Naomi glanced briefly at the empty seats where investors had been sitting just minutes ago, the echoes of their presence still visible in the untouched glasses and folded chairs. "Most people do," she answered, and that answer held something deeper than the conversation itself. It held the reason moments like this are rare, because speaking is not the hard part, seeing is, and acting on it is even harder. And Ethan nodded slowly, as if acknowledging something he could not argue with, something that did not fit into the way he had always measured success. And as the lights dimmed further and the staff prepared to close the room entirely, the space between them settled into something quieter, something more permanent, because this was no longer about a deal. It was about a shift in perspective that would not disappear when the night ended. And as Naomi turned to leave, her work done, her role complete, Ethan spoke again, not louder, not sharper, but clearer than before. "Next time, he said, pausing just enough for the words to matter. I will be looking too. And Naomi stopped for half a second, just long enough to acknowledge the sentence, before continuing on without turning back, because some changes do not need to be witnessed to be real. And behind her, in a room that had once belonged entirely to him, Ethan Caldwell stood alone, not defeated, not broken, but aware in a way he had never been before, and that awareness would cost him far more than $50 million, or perhaps, in time, it would be worth far more. The hallway outside the private dining suite was quieter than the room itself, the kind of quiet that follows something irreversible, and as Naomi stepped into it, the door closing softly behind her, the night seemed to return to normal for everyone else, but not for her, because moments like that do not end when you walk away. They stay with you, not as noise, but as clarity, and inside. Ethan remained standing where she had left him, the city lights still stretching beyond the glass. Unchanged, indifferent, a reminder that the world does not pause when something shifts. It keeps moving, whether you are ready or not, and he looked once more at the table, now perfectly reset. No trace of the tension, no evidence of the deal that had almost been signed. And that was the part that stayed with him. Not the loss, not the number, but how quickly everything could be erased on the surface while the real impact remained underneath. And slowly, he reached into his jacket, pulling out his phone, not to call, not to fix, but to review, to look again at the filings, the reports, the details he had trusted without question. Because for the first time in a long time, he was not assuming he was right, he was checking, and that shift, small as it seemed, was the real turning point, because power without awareness is fragile, and he had just seen how fragile it could be. And somewhere down the hall, Naomi continued her shift, blending back into the rhythm of the restaurant, unnoticed again, unremarkable to anyone who had not been in that room. And that was how it always was. The people who change everything are rarely the ones anyone is looking at, and yet, their impact lingers in ways that cannot be undone. And as the night moved forward and new guests filled new tables, the story of what had happened would not be told out loud. Not here, not in a place where reputation matters more than truth, but it would be remembered, in glances, in decisions, in the quiet caution that follows exposure. And Ethan finally turned away from the window. Not the same man who had walked into that room hours earlier, not because he had lost, but because he had seen something he could not unsee. And as he stepped out into the hallway, the distance between where he had been and where he was going felt different, not measured in money, not measured in power, but in awareness. And somewhere ahead, Naomi disappeared into the flow of the evening, carrying nothing with her except the same discipline she had always had, the same quiet certainty that did not need recognition to exist. And that was the part no one in that room could take from her, not the CEO, not the investors, not even the outcome itself, because in the end, she did not raise her voice, she did not claim the moment, she did not stay to be seen, she simply spoke the truth, and that was enough to change everything.